Okay, Bismillah. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa ashabihi, wa man walahu wa ba'd, wa alaykum assalam wa rahmatullah wa salihat. Can you tell me if the audio and video is okay? Just let me know if you can hear and see everything clearly, and then we'll jump right into it. Okay, great, alhamdulillah. So today we're going to be talking about reading Hanbali books. I am a big fan of kind of getting to work with what's necessary to learn and not necessarily dwelling over lots of honorifics and why this is the best madhab and things like that. I think that getting to work and getting your feet wet is one of the best ways to do anything. And that's how my teachers did it, and that's how I'll do it. So let's continue. So today we're going to be talking about the construction and terminology. So we're at the second lecture now of this introduction to the Hanbali Madhab. What do I mean when I say construction and methodology, terminology? Construction is the process of interpreting and formulating ideas or systems based on a set of principles or frameworks. So we have principles and a framework for understanding what Imam Ahmed said and what that means, what his ashab, what his companions said and what that means, how rulings were derived from that and how they are codified. That brings us to methodology. So we need a systematic approach or a set of procedures used to express and derive legal principles and positions of the school. A madhab is not just, hey, this random guy had lots of cool ideas, let's write it down. There is a rhyme and a reason. And we all know of usul al-fiqh. And usul al-fiqh, although before it was codified by Imam al-Shafi'i in al-Risala, it was present in the scholarly vernacular of scholars of his generation and back to the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It is misnomer to think that it was kind of created later on. I mean, this is a more philosophical discussion about information or about knowledge. You know, is knowledge discovered or is it created, right? And so all of these principles, excuse me, are found applied by the Prophet ﷺ, his companions, the tabi'een, and those after them, and everything. It kind of existed as one large body of Islamic thought. What then happened is that scholars started to say, okay, let me carve this out and specialize in this and start to make this a discipline in and of itself. So, for example, you have Imam al-Shafi'i who wrote al-Risala. Okay, you have Ar-Rama Hurmuzi who wrote the first book in al-Mustalah. Before that, you know, you'll find the issues of Ulum al-Quran and Mustalah al-Hadith and Dilalat al-Alfaz and al-Ijtihad, and all of these things are all together. Maqasid al-Sharia and all of these all together. And then Usul is kind of constructed and placed on its own. Mustalah is drawn out of that and it becomes its own thing. Maqasid becomes its own thing. Qawa'id fiqhiyya becomes its own thing. Takhrij al-usul al-furu', takhrij al-furu' al-usul, takhrij al-usul al-usul. So the idea of takhrij becomes its own thing. Then you get even to the ire of some, but this is normal, right? The application of the rational sciences. The Shafi'i, when he, and for example, Al-Ghazali and Al-Mustasfa, he says the four fundamental evidences are Al-Quran, was Sunnah, wal Ijma', and then he doesn't say Qiyas, he says Al-Aql, rationale. And then what do we mean by rationale? Do we mean by Ishab al-Hal and Qiyas al-Shumul and Qiyas al-Tamthil and all of these other things? And then where does the role of logic come into that? And are we talking about simply Aristotelian syllogisms? No, we're not talking about this. It's something much broader. And so the Semitic languages themselves have their own internal logic and their own internal forms of analogy, and this was developed through um, um, reading works of, say, the Greeks and the Persians and the Indians, and then developing this further, removing those things which are antithetical to Islam and leaving what was left. So even early discussions about philosophy are tempered by the fact that at one time philosophy was this giant hodgepodge of information that contained both good and bad. And so math was considered part of philosophy, and then it was broken off and it became mathematics. What is haram from that is this type of theoretical theology that supposes things about the divine, the unseen, and even the seen in ways that try to impose upon the texts of Islam meanings that are not necessarily or sometimes diametrically opposed to it. So my point in saying that is that the madhahib themselves, although they will generally agree in all of their usul or most of their usul, they themselves have their particular methodologies for how they would create rulings, and those ruling that different methodology could be in the principles of derivation, the hermeneutics of reading texts and taking out rulings, or it could simply just be in the process of how they follow up on or discover or create a ruling. Then there's terminology. Each school is going to have specific terminology. So if I said to you a sheikh and I am from the Hanabila, you will not understand that if you were a Shafi'i and you say a sheikh for someone else. So I believe it's a Shirazi in the Shafi'iyya. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. I'm not infallible. I will make mistakes during this. And one thing that we learned from our teachers was that never follow your teacher in his mistake. And so, if I make a mistake, then kindly remind me in the comments, and I'm be happy to make a correction. If you say sheikh in amongst the Hanabila, who do you mean? Do you mean Sheikh al-Islam? Do you mean Ibn Taymiyyah? Do you mean Ibn Qudama? Who do you mean? Right? We'll talk about these terminologies and how these terminologies can mean different people at different times of the madhab itself. Okay. So the construction of the Hanbali school. The Hanbali school has historically been subject to a lot of misconceptions about its stance and the use of analogy. So there are a number of early portrayals, right, that suggest that the Hanbali school is rigid, it's simplistic, that it that somehow it wasn't amenable to the idea of rationale. It wasn't amenable to the idea of the rational sciences, and this is not true, right? However, why do we know that? Because we know that the school evolved into a robust legal system with its own interpretations and methodologies, which are on par or surpass others. And so the authority of the Hanbali Madhab, like other Sunni schools of law, involved the collection, the systemization, and the transmission of the founders' opinions. And then subsequent scholars took that information and evolved it and interpreted it and constructed a school around it. So the evolution and the construction of the Hanbali school did not differ from the other three schools, and we touched on a little bit of that yesterday. So what was Imam Ahmed's methodology? And Imam Ahmed rahmatullah alayhi was very strict in his adherence to the Quran and the Sunnah, right? And he looked to the authority of the companions and the fiqh of the Salaf from amongst the companions and the Tabi'in, right? And his fatwa, they reflect not only the meanings found in the sacred texts, but also those of the precedents of the Salaf, right? So the Salaf and the things that they did are reflected in Imam Ahmed, right? So if there's a single opinion that existed from them, then essentially, the Hanbali school would look at this as having the weight of ijma, or a type of ijma, because no one existed to oppose that if it was from the companions. So companions said something, no one opposed it, and therefore it was going to be given the weight of ijma, which some coin as ijma as-sukuti. Okay, but if there were multivariant fatwa between the companions without one evidence that would prove one of them more preponderant, then at-takhayyur, or choosing between them, was permissible. If there were differences between the companions and there was a text that bolstered the opinion of one over the other, then the opinion of the companion along with that text would create a whole evidence for why that opinion was stronger, even if that text was weak. So weak hadith were allowed as a murajjah, as a corroborating evidence, when there were multivariant opinions. So let's do two examples. For example, if a person comes to the masjid for Salat al-Fajr and they find the Imam praying, do they go to the back of the masjid and pray Sunnah al-Fajr, or do they join the Imam in prayer and then pray their Sunnah immediately after the Fajr finishes? The madhab of the Hanabila is that when you enter the masjid, you do not pray anything. If the obligatory prayer has been established, you join the obligatory prayer, then you pray your sunnahs after that, even for Fajr. What do they base this on? Well, this is the action of Abdullah ibn Umar. Okay, but we find that Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, it's narrated from him in Musannaf of Abd al-Razzaq, that he would go to the far off corner of the masjid and pray 2 rak'ahs while the Imam was praying, and then join the Fajr prayer. Okay, so now we have two opinions. We have two companions who are seemingly opposed in what action should be taken in this very specific situation. So we as Hanabila will look for a murajjah. What is the murajjah? Well, we look to first verses of the Quran. We don't find anything. We look to the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We find إذا أقيمت الصلاة فلا صلاة إلا المكتوبة. If the prayer has been established, there is no prayer except for the obligatory prayer. You might say, but that could be interpretive, and maybe that Abdullah ibn Mas'ud interpreted that. But then we have the other ahadith in Sahih Muslim, where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in his lifetime saw a man enter, or he was praying Fajr. A man entered, prayed 2 rak'ahs, then joined the Fajr prayer and finished the 2 rak'ahs with the Prophet alaihi salam. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, as-salatu arba', as-salatu arba', is prayer now 4? Is prayer now 4? We have another narration where he said, بِأَيِّ رَكَعَتَيْنِ اعْتَدَيْتَ أو اعْتَدَدْ, which of the 2 rak'ahs did you count when you were praying? Meaning, should you have been in that, or should you have been in this? So these, along with these 3 hadith, indicate that the action of Abdullah ibn Umar was closer to the truth than the action of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. This is why this is the opinion of not only Hanabila, but the Shafi'i and the Maliki as well. Although our scholars from the Hanafi school take the opinion of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud as something which is permissible in this situation. I'm not here to say that one is better than the other. I'm here to say that when we have differences of opinion between the two companions, what's the tiebreaker? Well, if we have an authentic tiebreaker, then we take that authentic tiebreaker. What if we have a situation where, let's say, brigands or renegades or terrorists, right, are caught and they need to be executed? How are they to be executed? This is an issue that was faced by the companions in the time of Ali, radiallahu anhu. So there were people, sometimes known as a Saba'iyya, that the followers of Abdullah ibn Saba, who were claiming that Ali radiallahu anhu was God. And they were, and he had his servant Qumbur, who went and rounded them up. They were fighting against Muslims, and he rounded them up. And he told them to repent, and they refused. And so he told his فَلَمَّا رَأَيْتُ الْأَمْرَ أَمْرًا مُنْكَرًا أَجَّجْتُ نَارِي وَدَعَوْتُ قُنْبُرًا, as it's attributed to Ali radiallahu anhu, that he said, when I saw the issue becoming an evil issue, I lit my fires and I called on Qumbur. And he had Qumbur basically, burn them in a pit. And then the people, said, oh, well, you must be Allah because, you're burning us in the hellfire. This is obviously your hellfire. So when this news of this reached Abdullah ibn Abbas, radiallahu anhu, he said this was wrong. And he, radiallahu anhu, he said, لو كنت مكانك لما فعل لو كنت مكانه لما فعلت ما فعل ولا قتلتهم بالسيف. If I were in his place and I had to do what he was doing, I would have executed them by the sword. Now, which of these two opinions do we have? Do we execute people with reciprocity to the action that they had done, or do we are all executions by sword? And this extends to all forms of executions under Islamic penal law, right? The madhab is that executions are only done by sword, and there's not this idea of reciprocity, because many times you can't guarantee that the punishment and or the execution would be done in a way that's exactly the same. What is the murajjih in this situation? It is a hadith la qawada illa bis-sayf. There's no execution except by the sword. Now this hadith is narrated in the Muslim Imam Ahmed with a chain that has weakness in it. Now later scholars considered this hasan, but that doesn't mean that Imam Ahmed did. It was considered weak according to him. But this relatively weak hadith, along with the opinion of Abdullah ibn Abbas, who, by the way, this is narrated from him in the Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba, and Al-Hafiz ibn Hajar says in Al-Fath that it's authentic. It shows that this weak hadith with the opinion of the companion is the more correct opinion in this situation than the action of Ali radiyallahu ta'ala anhu wa an jami' as-sahabati ajma'in. So, when there are multivariate opinions, the Hanbali Madhab has this very unique opinion that weak hadith, as long as the hadith does not contain somebody known for fabrication or lying, and that the problem with it is issues of memory, is acceptable as a corroborating evidence when their meaning of that hadith is found in other indications, other texts. Okay, there is an attempt in the madhab and Imam Ahmed's madhab to avoid ra'i, to avoid raw opinion as much as possible, to avoid simply expressing preference, right? So he much more preferred to do what? To mention from the Book of Allah, from the Sunnah, from the statements of the companions, from the Tabi'een, from the Atba' Tabi'een, from the scholars that preceded him. لا تقل في مسألة إلا ولك فيها إمام. Do not make a statement about an issue unless you have an imam therein. This is a famous statement from him, rahimahullah ta'ala. So he tried to avoid his personal opinions and inclinations as much as possible until it presented itself. And essentially what this is not saying that derivation is not possible and juristic analysis is not possible. What Imam Ahmed is trying to encourage is a full-scale induction of the evidences before coming to a conclusion. As we see that even he, as well as others, did express opinions that had not been opined on before him, but they did so according to the methodologies and the principles of the scholars that came before them. He had a severe dislike for hypothesizing and for problematizing issues that had not happened yet, right? He used to say, دعنا من هذه المسائل المحدثة. Leave us from these concocted issues. So he did not like the Socratic method that was very common, let's say, for example, amongst his other Iraqi scholarly brethren, amongst the madhahib of Abu Hanifa and Sufyan and others, right, who had no problem kind of problematizing and working through hypotheticals. Imam Ahmed was much closer to Imam Malik in that sense of not allowing for that to be the norm. Okay. Okay, what is the let's just take this right now. Okay, so Abu Salihati says, how accurate is Shaykh al-Islam's assessment that the weak hadith used in the madhab were actually Hasan hadith? There is an inherent contradiction in Shaykh al-Islam's opinion. Rahmatullah alayhi. Why? Because what is known from the statements of Imam Ahmed and from the statements of those who followed this opinion was that تجوز أو يجوز استعمال الحديث الضعيف أو يجوز العمل بالحديث الضعيف في الفضائل لا في الأحكام. It is permissible to act according to weak hadith in actions, acts of virtue, not in rulings. So if we say that the weak hadith is hasan and we replace the words, it is permissible to use a hasan hadith in virtues, not in ahkam. No one has said that in the history of Islam. And therefore, the weak hadith, according to Imam Ahmed, was not simply the hasan. It might have been the hasan hadith according to some later scholars who, again, through the idea of corroborating evidences, brought together multiple narrations and had al-hadith li ghayrihi, right? But many times what the mutaakhirin of the muhaddithin would say was al-hadith or al-hasan li ghayrihi, many times was just considered to be weak amongst earlier scholars. But because it was weak does not mean that it wasn't salihun lil ihtijaj, that it wasn't appropriate for using as an evidence. But what kind of evidence? An evidence that was corroborated by other narrations. So, for example, Abu Dawood in his Sunan, one of the great Hanbali scholars, one of the people of the 6 books of Hadith, who he said, وَمَا سَكَتْتُ عَنْهُ فَهُوَ صَالِحٌ لِلْإِحْتِجَاجِ. Whatever I am silent on in this book, then it is acceptable as an evidence. Does he mean a standalone evidence? No, he does not. What he means is that it is a corroborating evidence along with other narrations that have stronger asanid and similar indications, but maybe aren't as express in their phrases. Okay. Okay. So, who are the ashab? The ashab or the companions of Imam Ahmed. What was their methodology? They followed the methodology of the Imam. They tried to avoid analogy as a principle. So not that qiyas was unacceptable, but they saw that qiyas was something that should not be resorted to early on before you have actually done the work to find out the textual indications. They allowed for ijtihad, and they refused to say that the door to ijtihad was closed as long as the person met the conditions for ijtihad, right? There's a general allowance of all conditions in contracts, contending that nothing is invalid or void unless the Sharia substantiates it through the text or through qiyas. So the Hanabila, the Madhab al-Hanabila, is much broader in its acceptance of conditions and contracts than other madhahib. And in fact, I would say that the opinions of the Hanabila in general and of Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim and Ibn Rajab in specific are somewhat revolutionary for the ideas of business and finance. They would apply istishab al-hal in issues of al-ibaha, al-afu, and al-bara'at al-asliya. So istishab al-hal is very similar to the common law idea of stare decisis, where you take a previously decided issue or ruling and you simply draw it through to the present time. You don't try to create a new ruling when there's a ruling that has consistently existed, right? And so if something was known to be mubah, it was known to be permissible, it continues to be so. If something was known to be pardoned and left alone, it continues to be so. If something is known to be permitted because nothing was said to the opposite, it continues to be so until something comes and proves the opposite. And then also another methodology of ashab was the idea of sadd al-dhari'ah, that the Sharia came to not only encourage the good and forbid the evil, but also cut off the means to evil occurring. Okay, so let's talk about mustalahat al-imam. What are the phrases that Imam Ahmed would use, right? So there's a number of different types of phrases that he, rahimahullah ta'ala, would use. So they are explicit and unequivocal phrases that there was no opposition to, and this is considered his madhab. Now, I'm going to preface the next couple of slides because we're going to rip through them pretty quickly. The work's already been done, guys. Somebody yesterday mentioned al-Mardawi, and I think, if you kind of just relied on al-Mardawi and all of this in al-Insaf and in his other works, the work has already been done. But it's important for us to understand the methodology and the process that went into it, right? So if Imam Ahmed, stated something and he explicitly retracted his opinion, right? Or it's explicitly mentioned by his ashab that it was an old opinion, then it's not his madhab, right? If those that make taqlid of Ahmed report no change in his opinion or no re-inquiring about an issue despite a change in the issue, then it's still considered his madhab, right? So Zahir al-Riwaya, right, is the apparent opinion of the Imam, meaning that one can indicate that there is, or a Zahir Riwaya, an apparent opinion of the Imam is one that can indicate more than one meaning and can be interpreted with an evidence which is stronger than that used, right? Therefore, if there's no stronger evidence to be used, and there's no legislative, linguistic, or custom-based principle to prevent the application of that, then it's considered his school. So if the Imam said something which could be interpreted one way or the other, but it was always held to be in one of those ways, then we simply stick to what it was apparently taken as the opinion of the Imam in that situation. A mujmal riwayah, or riwayatun mujmala, is in need of clarification. Okay, so when we need clarification, what are we going to do? We're going to go to his madhab, his statements, his indications, his inclinations. Did a number of his students say this? Did a number of his students indicate this? Are there statements where he was inclined to one opinion more than the other, but he never said anything expressly? So what are these phrases that were used by the Imam? Right. So, for example, there are phrases that Imam Ahmed. This is beneficial when you read the riwayat, the masail, like you get Masail Salih or Masail al-Muhanna Shami or Masail al-Kawsaj or Masail Abdullah or Masail Abi Dawood. Then it's important for you to kind of understand what you're reading and not read beyond it or read it too loosely. So if he said for something la yaslah or la yanbaghi, this is unbefitting or unbecoming, then this indicates his prohibition or dislike. If he says huwa qabih or la arahu, this is disgusting, or I don't see this to be valid, right? Or ankara alayhi, right? Hada haram or akrahuhu or la yu'jibuni, right? Fahuwa haramun wa qila makruh. If he says this is haram, or I dislike it, or this doesn't impress me, then it's considered to be haram. And some said it indicates dislike. Phrases that indicate dislike, like his statement akrahuhu, I dislike this, or la yu'jibuni, right? It doesn't impress me, then it is not impermissible, but is makruh, and the opposite has been said as well. So you'll have scholars of the madhab that have said that in this context, when he said akrahuhu, he meant dislike. In this context, he meant that was haram. And how do we know which context was indicated? Inductive review of all of his statements. And like I said, that work has already been done in the madhab. But it's important for you to understand it, because you don't want to go and say, oh, I read in the Masail of Abu Dawood that Imam Ahmed said this, and this means it is clearly haram. And everyone who does that is clearly sinful, when the scholars of the madhab contextualized that according to other statements of the Imam and said, no, he simply meant that it was disliked, not that it was something was sinful. And so you can many times kind of extrapolate way too far out when you don't know how the phrases are being used. You have other things like, هذا أحب إلي أو أحبه, or هذا حسن, or هذا أحسن, أو أستحسنه, أو يعجبني. All of these phrases are similar in indicating that he had preference or obligation. All right. Give me just one moment. I'll be right back. Okay, let's continue. So one example that's here on the page is: do you need to turn an animal towards the qibla when you are slaughtering it, right? So he said, "Hu ahabbu ilay." This indicates that he preferred that to be done, but not that it was an absolute obligation. Why did he prefer it to be done? Well, because there's indications from, I believe, Abdullah ibn Umar that he did that. Therefore, he preferred it. But can you say that it is unequivocally an absolute must? No, you can't do that. Okay. Phrases that indicate unrestricted permissibility. Right? He says, "La ba'sa bihi." There's no harm in this. "Arju an la yakuna bihi ba's." I hope that there's no harm in that. Right? All of these are considered to be a type of ibaha, or that something is permissive. Phrases that can have more than one meaning in context. So if he says, for example, akhaf an yakun kada, I'm fearful that this is so and so, or akhsha an yakuna kada, I'm apprehensive or scared that this might not be allowed, right? Then is this like him saying that it is permissible or not permissible? So some Hanbali scholars, they held these phrases to be indicative of doubt or a lack of opinion on the issue. Others said that this was not considered to be an explicit fatwa, but was a means of making things easier for people. So if the Imam answers a question, and then he says something similar to, like, this is hada ashab, right? Or hada akhaf, or hada aqwa, or hada ashar. This is easier, this is lesser, this is stronger, this is worse. Then it's said, some have said that he held two opinions on the topic. Others said that the meanings are the same. If the meanings are the same, then they're held to be the same, and if not, then they're not. Right? So everything is read in context. Right? If he said "ani akhyaru minhu," right, then more preferred in this manner, then it means that it is permissible, and some have said that it might be permissible, but it's disliked. The general principle about all these phrases is that the apparent meanings of the words are taken at face value, they track closely to their linguistic and textual usage, and then they are read in context and with corroborating evidences that surrounded them. Right? Again, that's all, all that work has been done for the Imam as well as for the Ashab. Right? So amongst the Ashab, if they say "Hada huwa al-madhhab," this is the madhhab, right? Then this may be because of an explicit text of the Imam, or his indications, or their inference and derivation from his statements and rationale. But when they're saying this is the madhhab, they are more sure of what the exact opinion of Ahmed was in those situations than we are. And so I think that one thing that's very important in the study of a madhhab is developing a sense of humility, is developing a sense of deference and reverence for the scholarship that has preceded you. And there can be a very irreverent tone that people have, wiping out the efforts of centuries of scholarship, simply because they didn't understand what they were talking about, and they didn't understand the breadth of knowledge that those people actually had. Right? Abu Salihat, did the Imam respond with his opinion I do not like because of his wara, as opposed to simply saying the nas says? Well, if there's no nas, right? Nas is a clear-cut text. So perhaps he didn't have a clear-cut text. And perhaps he described, he answered out of wara, and perhaps it was to make things easier. But all of those things are read in context, right? And again, as I mentioned, I think in some of the comments yesterday, this is not the be all end all of this topic. I'm presenting this topic in English. Preferably, you're going to go and use this as a jumping board to studies in the Arabic language. I'm not a big fan of only relying on translations. I think that any serious student of knowledge has to get their Arabic up to a level where they can communicate, understand, and study in the Arabic language. And that's absolutely necessary. Can it be studied in other languages as well? Yes, but it will never be the same as the indications of the Arabic language, even if it is an Islamicate language like Persian or Urdu or Turkish or anything else. Hausa, right? You have languages where there are deep learning traditions in those languages, but that it will never be the same as studying in Arabic, because the primary texts of Islam are found in Arabic, and therefore the general indications of those texts are going to be better understood when they are understood in their original language. Okay, if the ashab say something like ala al-asah, al-sahih, al-zahir, al-mashhur, al-ashhar, al-aqwa, al-aqyas, al-aqwa, right? Aqwa is then this may be from the Imam, or it may be from some of those ashab. So according to the more correct, or the correct, or the apparent, or the famous, or the more famous, or the stronger, or the more analogous, then this could be from a statement of the Imam. It could be from what the ashab understood from the Imam. If they say waqil, and this may be a narration due to indication or derivation from a narration, or simply a possibility. If the ashab say, the opinion of Imams, the madhab of Imam Ahmed is X, waqila, and it's been said, why? Why could be because there is another narration from the Imam. It could be because there's another understanding of the statements of the Imam, and it could simply just be a logical possibility of what else could be said. The word riwayah is predominantly considered to be directly from the Imam, like them saying wa anhu, and from him, and this may be explicit or implicit. And if you're watching this and you're saying, I don't know what this guy's talking about, then you may not have studied much of the madhab and you may not be familiar with it. But I assure you, if you go and study some classes and then come back to this, you're going to go, oh, okay, now I get what he was talking about. Or if you're in class, you go, okay, that's what Joe had mentioned when they say fi wajhin, a wajhuhu, right? Then, a wedge or a facet are those things that are taken predominantly from the statements of the Imams, or similar issues of his indications and rationale. There's something called takhrij. Takhrij is the idea of relating one ruling on something back to something similar to it, right? Considering them to have the effective weight, right? It's very similar to saying wedge, except that when you say wedge, takhrij it's similar to saying wedge, but is not takhrij unless the meaning is understood, right? Al-ihtimal, or muhtamil, right? This is a type of kind of bending of the opinion. I don't mean that in a negative sense, where it has the possibility of being a facet from the Imam. The former is something well established, whereas there may be less than preponderant evidence in the school to indicate something else, and so the school will mention not only the preponderant evidence, but the less than preponderant evidence, and even sometimes the weaker evidence. And this is why we have these general opinions, because the scholarly trust that they have is to convey all of this information. This is a core attribute of Ahlul Hadith in particular, and of the scholars of Islam in general, and that is يَذْكُرُونَ مَا لَهُمْ وَمَا عَلَيْهِمْ. They mention what is for them and what is against them, They mention everything that has come. So the idea of, well, what is the rajih? And I want to follow the rajih. And then this is the rajih. Well, first of all, the rajih according to whom? And secondly, the rajih according to what? And thirdly, the rajih according to which set of evidences. So, the fact that we have things is a very simple example. The fact that we have things that are wajib, obligatory, mustahab, preferred, mubah, unrestricted or permissible, makruh, disliked, haram, impermissible, shows that there is a gradient. There is a gradient between these different juxtaposed opinions. And therefore, as there are gradients in the way that we understand things, there will be gradients in the predominance of or the preponderance of one opinion over the other. Okay. Al-waqf. أو توقف فيه, or when the imam simply doesn't state an opinion, right? Or he abstains from mentioning an opinion, right? This means that there was a lack of surety about any opinion, affirming or denying, as there may be contradictory evidence. Of course, that's contradictory in its apparent state, not in its reality, as there's no true contradiction, right? But the imam had not come to a conclusion, and therefore he abstained from issuing an opinion. You'll find that the ashab will say al-qawl, the opinion, the statement in this. This phrase is used to mean a wajh, an ihtimal, a takhrij, or even a riwayah, right? It's very frequently used amongst early scholars, and then later scholars, as well as scholars in the middle period, use these terms in more standardized senses. Okay, let's talk about mustalahat, phrases or terminologies related to personas. A sheikh, during Ibn Taymiyyah's lifetime, right, like when it was used in al-Furu' or al-Fa'iq, it referred to Ibn Qudama. If it was used post Ibn Taymiyyah, like in the Marginalia on al-Furu' or in Bahuti's works or others, it meant Ibn Taymiyyah. So if you're reading from somebody in the 8th century, right, then, and they say, قال الشيخ, or أخذ به الشيخ, the sheikh said, or the sheikh took this opinion, it's referring to Ibn Qudama. And if you're reading like Al-Bahuti and Kashaf al-Qina' or others, and he says a sheikh, he's referring to Ibn Taymiyyah. If they say a sheikhan, the two sheikhs, they're talking about Ibn Qudama and Majd ibn Taymiyyah, the grandfather of Ahmed bin Abd al-Halim ibn Taymiyyah, the famous Shaykh al-Islam. If we say Ash-Sharih, talking about Shams ad-Din ibn Qudama, Abdurrahman ibn Umar al-Maqdisi, Ibn Qudama's nephew and student. If the word al-Qadi is used, we're talking about al-Qadi Abu Ya'la al-Farra. If there is a phrase like نصا أو عنه, يعني والقول في ذلك كذا 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 نصا, and the opinion on this is such and such and such and such, textually نصا, then it means Imam Ahmed said this. You're going to find that he said this explicitly. Or anhu, and from him, كذا. From him is this, you're going to find that explicitly from the Imam. Ash-Sharh generally refers to the explanation of the book that's being commented on. But given that one of the very first books, right, to be explained, and all other explanations refer back to, many times it's talking about Ibn Abi Umar's book Ash-Shafi, or Ash-Sharh al-Kabir, is many times simply referred to as Ash-Sharh. If someone says Shaykhuna, right, for Ibn Aqil or Abu al-Khattab, if they say Shaykhuna, they mean Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la. If it's Ibn al-Qayyim or Ibn Muflih or Al-Hajjawi, then they're talking about Ibn Taymiyyah, right? All the books after Al-Hajjawi basically take his lead on the phrases that he used. Okay. Another thing about and this is not related to personas, but it's important, is indications of khilaf, indications of difference. So if the scholars use the word hatta, even if this shows a strong khilaf. If they use the word in, if, then it refers to a medium difference of opinion and strength. And if they say walau and even if, right, and although, then it would indicate a weak khilaf. Okay, dealing with multiple riwayat. Number one, why are there multiple narrations? So the Imam was piously hesitant to choose one of the several opinions narrated from the Salaf on any given issue. Meaning that if there were multiple opinions from the Salaf, that they did not differ substantively, but they differed in their type, then he simply accepted all of them and allowed for things to be chosen between them. You will find differing narrations from the Imam in one issue from different narrators, right? In this case, each narration is considered a separate opinion as long as there's nothing to give predominance of one over the other. When the Imam is hesitant to issue a ruling with two possibilities still being acceptable, right? He sometimes will leave it without giving an opinion. So if he's hesitant and leaves it without opinion, and that can mean one or two things, that means those two possibilities stand. Right? Sometimes the Imam Ahmed would take into consideration the situation of the person asking the question and therefore answer based on that. And then another person with the same situation, but I'm going to say the same issue, but a similar situation would ask, he would answer according to that. Right? So giving the fatwa according to the situation of each person was the norm. Right? Some may think that this means that he has two opinions on the issue, but in reality, he does not. He has one substantive principle that he applies in different situations consistently. That's a very important idea to get down. Right? The possibility of him giving fatwa in very rare circumstances, according to analogy or utility, so qiyas or istihsan, is possible, right? But if he came across a text transmitted on that issue later, then his opinion would be different. So you might find that he answers early on according to something which is analogous, or he relates the analogy of a previous scholar and then finds a text that did not reach that scholar. He would then use that text. The presence of more than one hadith on an issue can be a reason why there are multiple narrations from the Imam. And although the Hanbali school allows for ijtihad and allows for a variance of opinions, right, it also allows for those opinions to be applied differently by a mujtahid at another time. So these are the reasons why there might be multiple narrations, because of the time, the circumstance, the context, or the determination of what all of that means at a given time during the lifetime of the Imam. So how did the Ashab deal with these variant opinions from Imam Ahmed? If they could take two opinions and show that they can coexist, then they took them as so. If they showed that they could not coexist, then they would consider to be the later of the two, or the latter of the two opinions, the one that came later, to be the official school, and the earlier to be not the official school, but narrated from him. Some scholars of the madhab would consider both to be official school opinions, and they would leave the application to later scholars. A smaller group of scholars held that the first opinion would be the official school, even if the Imam abandoned it. So now you have, more than one opinion by the Imam. If you can determine the date, right, you would do it as previous. But what if you can't determine the date? Then the official school is what's closest to the opinions that are found or indications of the texts of the book and the sunnah and ijma' and the narrations of the salaf, as well as the principles of his school. If the ruling of these two opinions is the same, but not the action predicated on them, then the mufti or the mujtahid has the option to apply and to give a fatwa with either. If we're supposed to look at the signs and indications of each opinion, right? If we were to suppose that the signs and the indications of each opinion are exactly the same, then in this case we would look. Let's say we've got two opinions, both from the Imam. The textual evidences are equally strong. The indications are equally strong. Everything's the same. Then the Ashab would say, okay, which one was stated by the Imam more? Which one has more people narrating this response from the Imam than others? Which one was more famous than others? Which of those scholars were with the Imam longer and were more knowledgeable and pious? And they would therefore give precedent to that over what was simply more cautious. And then the Ashab would make qiyas on the madhab of Imam Ahmed. And some said, yes, you can make qiyas on the madhab. Others said no. And others said yes, if there is a express legal rationale behind that, right? If he gave fatwa on two separate issues that there are similar rulings for, but they were given at two separate times, then they permitted to apply one ruling to the other. And they said that this depends on the circumstances about which one was possibly earlier or more predominant, as we had talked about. If the Imam was silent on some things, right, when there is rebuke for his ruling after his fatwa, is this considered it to be an abandonment of his opinion? If the Imam states one thing and then later on he states the exact opposite of that thing, is that him considering his early opinion to be abandoned, or him simply stating another opinion, right? If one of his companions explains what his school was, then we would take that to be, if for example, he was asked about, al-khattaf or khashaf, and these animals and whether or not they're permissible or not, then if one of his students said that means this, then they would take that to be indicative of what the Imam meant. If some of his companions or narrators relate on their own an opinion from him, and it has strong evidence, then they would accept it as the addition from a thiqah. The issue of ziyadat thiqah in hadith is applied here in fiqh, right? Just as it is acceptable in hadith, it would be acceptable in an issue of fiqh, right? If not, right, it is not, as the possibility of mistakes may be more probable from one group, or more probable than a group. So there are some who said, well, if you have a single scholar who said that the Imam said this, and he has knowledge that is in addition to what everybody is saying, and he is trustworthy and close to the Imam, and it has strong evidences, they would say, well, if we allow the additional narration of a hadith, we can now allow the additional narration of a fiqh opinion. And others have said that no, if that one person said that and he goes against everyone else who is equally of that status, then it's more probable that he's wrong than the group. If the Imam answers a question with the Quran or the Sunnah or a consensus or the statement of a companion, then that is considered to be his school. So that's considered to be an express opinion that he didn't have to restate. He simply transmitted as it is. If he narrates something from the Prophet or a statement of the companions and considers it authentic, or he's happy with its isnad, or it's included in one of his books and he did not reject it, then that's considered his madhab as well. If he mentioned something as having two opinions from the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as we mentioned earlier, then the one that is closer to the sacred text and consensus is considered his school, else it is not. And then others have said that if he mentions two opinions, then he's obviously not giving prominence to one of them over the other, and therefore both are acceptable. There are a number of other situations. We think we talked about this earlier in the lecture. If he mentions the disagreement to the companions or their followers or other than them, and he doesn't indicate his inclination to either of them, then his school is considered the stronger of them with regards to the book and the sunnah and the narrations of the salaf. If he mentions a disagreement on an issue and indicates its acceptance, right, then his acceptance of that is acceptance of one opinion. If he mentions a rationale for one of two opinions, but expresses his preference for one, even if he doesn't mention the rationale, then the one he expressed is considered the preference for his school, as he would not do so unless he thought the opinion was strong. There are about 14 other situations that are mentioned for preferring or understanding his school when the history of opinion is not known. We're definitely not going to get into that now. But the point of all of this is to impress upon you. And if you're saying nothing that you said is related to an individual opinion, brothers and sisters, if we were to go through an example for each one of the situations that we talked about, we would be here until tomorrow morning or for the next couple of days. What I want to impress upon you is the sheer number of possibilities that were analyzed and reviewed and codified and standardized in order to come up with a book of fiqh. And so it is very important that you have a sense of deference. If Imam Ahmed himself is saying don't have an opinion on something that you don't have an imam in, and then you come 1400 years later and say, no, everybody's wrong, I'm right, and you haven't done the homework or studied a school, and it doesn't have to even be a codified school of Islamic law. You haven't even studied an entire book of hadith. Let's push on the brakes a little bit, slow down, and take our time to learn what the Salaf themselves were doing, which was learning fiqh according to the scholars that preceded them, which is all a madhab is. Madhab is a concordance of issues that have been opined on from the prophetic time until your time. And as Sheikh Salih Fawzan said, and I heard him say this during i'tikaf, and I think it was 2005 in the Haram al-Makki, he said, كتب الفقه فيها الخطأ والصواب ونحن ندرس كتب الفقه لكي نقف على الصواب ونقرره، نقف على الخطأ ونبينه، أو كما قال أو كما أذكره. He said, we study the books of fiqh expressly because somebody asked the question, why do we study books of fiqh when there are correct and incorrect things in the books of fiqh? He said, we study the books of fiqh expressly because there are correct and incorrect things in it. The correct things we establish and we give the evidences for, and the incorrect things we clarify when that is the case. And I can guarantee you, if you've ever studied any book of fiqh, you know that the idea of there being books of fiqh that are rife with incorrect opinions or based on rife with weak hadith that are unacceptable is just simply not true. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the tabaqat, the levels of the madhab and the mu'tamad in each. And we're coming up kind of on the end of the slides here, but let's go over this. Okay, so the early Hanbalis, right, are Al-Qadi Abu Ya'la, who died in 458, and anyone earlier than him, starting with Ibn Hamid and the early Ashab. When the scholars of the madhab say al-jama'ah, they're talking about everybody from this time, from the mid 5th century before. So they're talking about people like Abu Talib al-Mishkani, Ibrahim ibn Ishaq al-Harbi, Harb al-Kirmani, Salih ibn Ahmed ibn Hanbal, Abdullah ibn Ahmed ibn Hanbal, Hanbal ibn Ishaq ibn Hanbal, the Imam's uncle. So the madhab for this stage, the official madhab for this stage, is what the Jama'ah relate unanimously. Then what's found in the books of Al-Khalal, who died 311. This is a book called Jami' al-Riwayat, right? And that related by Ibn Hani al-Athram in his Masail. And then, if you don't have a unanimous opinion, then you look at what a group of them agree upon. like Ahmed ibn Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Udmi, or Abu Bakr Ghulam al-Khalal, or al-Khiraqi, or al-Bushanji, or Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Ajurri, or Ibn Shaqillah, or al-Marwazi, or al-Barbahari. Yes, that Barbahari. He is considered to be from amongst the earlier scholars of the madhab, and his opinion is accepted. So what do? We look at what a group of these scholars at this early stage agreed upon, and we say that that is the madhab. Then we have this middle stage of the madhab, okay? And this is like going into the 6th century of the Hijrah. So whatever Abu al-Khattab al-Kalwadani, who died in 510, he says in his Al-Hidayah, and Abu al-Wafa ibn Aqil, who died in 513, said in the Tadhkirah, if they agree upon it, then it's considered the madhab, especially if it's an agreement with the previous stage. Otherwise, whatever's in the Hidayah of Al-Kalwadani, and the Hidayah of Al-Kalwadani has been printed. Then, after them, we look at what Ibn Qudama said in Al-Kafi and Al-Majd said in Al-Muharrar, especially if it is supported by Abu al-Fath ibn al-Munni. And if they differ, then we take the statement of Al-Kafi, or a statement that Ibn Taymiyyah, Majd al-Din ibn Taymiyyah agrees with. Right? No, I'm sorry. Then if they differ, then we take what's in Al-Kafi, or what Ahmed ibn Abdul Halim ibn Taymiyyah agreed with from amongst the statements of Ibn Qudama and Majd al-Din. Then we look to Ibn Muflih and al-Furu' and al-Dujayli and al-Wajiz. Both have been printed. I highly recommend any student of the madhab to have al-Furu'. It's a phenomenal book. If they disagree, then we look to Ibn Hamdan and al-Ri'ayah and Ibn Abdus and his Tadhkirah. Okay, all of these previous works have basically taken the speech of these earliest generations. They've polished it for us. They've laid out the principles of the school with certainty, right? Then, and if there are differences found amongst them, then we look to, or something that wasn't stated before, we look to what Ibn Muflih says in Al-Furu' and we give that precedence. And if he mentions a difference of opinion without giving any preference to either, then we look to what Shaykhan Ibn Qudama and Majd al-Din said, or whatever Ibn Muflih agrees with one of those two. Then becomes the madhab. Else, we look to Ibn Rajab or Ibn Taymiyyah for kind of being the tiebreaker or the deciding factor on what the madhab is. Who are the mutaakhirun? Who are the later scholars of the madhab? The later scholars of the madhab, everyone who came after Ibn Qudama. And what is the mu'tamad at this stage? The mu'tamad at this stage, we have al-Mardawi at the forefront with al-Tanqih al-Mushbi', and then al-Hajjawi with al-Iqna' and Zad al-Mustaqni', and then al-Futuhi with Muntaha al-Iradat. If they all agree, then that's considered the official madhab, the official school. And if they differ, then what two or more of them agree upon. And if none of them agree, then we take what's in al-Muntaha. So what is knowing the mu'tamad in our time rely upon? It relies upon this latter group of scholars, and it should be acted upon. This is the opinion of Abdul Malik Dahesh, rahmatullah alayh, one of the scholars of Hanabila from Mecca, who wrote a very good introduction to the madhab in Arabic that you should all read. Okay, I noticed that we didn't get into like al-Buhuti and others because they're considered part of the mutaakhirin, right? Al-Buhuti writes, in Sharh al-Muntaha. When we get to the works of al-Buhuti, we'll talk about that a little bit more. Lastly, what are types of Hanbali books? We have books of hadith, namely the Musnad of Imam Ahmed, the Sunan of Abu Dawud, the Sunan of Tirmidhi, both who are students, or Abu Dawud is a student of Imam Ahmed, right? I believe Tirmidhi narrates from Ahmed. Don't quote me on that. Again, I could, be making a mistake, and I don't want to be attributing something incorrectly. But please correct me if I'm simply having a lapse of memory. The books of Fadal al-Sahaba by the Imam, the Sunan of al-Athram, The Sunan of Sa'id ibn Mansur is used extensively by the scholars of the madhab. You have the books of fiqh, the books of usul, the books of qawaid, the books of mufradat that we talked about yesterday, and the books of adab like al-adab al-shar'iyyah by Ibn Muflih that inshallah ta'ala we'll be covering on the school platform. So my question is, before anybody comes and kind of comments on any given madhab, how many books of the madhab have you read? How many can you even name? It's like, I remember a brother, may Allah forgive him, he was criticizing one of the imams here in town who, he wasn't happy with an opinion that he expressed on the minbar. And he was claiming that he was ignorant of the sunnah. And he asked me to mediate the dispute between him and the imam. And I said, you don't want me to mediate the dispute. He said, no, I want you to. I said, okay, well, if I'm going to be free to say what I want, I'll be free to say what I want. He said, okay, sure. So I said to him, how many books of hadith, let's leave off all other sciences. How many books of hadith have you actually read cover to cover? The Kutub al-Sitta? No. Bukhari? No. Muslim? No. Abu Dawud? No. Tirmidhi? Ibn Majah? An-Nasa'i? No. Riyadh al-Salihin? No. Al-Arba'in Nawawiyah? No. The Imam was somebody who not only had read all of those books, but had ijazah in those books, bis-sama', having sat and read physically, not just going up to the sheikh and say, hey, sheikh, I'd like an ijazah in your books, but having actually read those books with a scholar. So it's very important that we take into consideration the breadth of Islamic heritage before we become extremely critical of them. So my challenge to you is, how many books can you mention of each, just off the top of your head? Okay, let's go and look at some of the questions. What book do I recommend for starters? I would recommend that you go on my YouTube channel and you look at the book Qaddumi's Elementary Primer, Qaddumi's Primer, known as Al-As'ilat Al-Ajwibat Al-Jaliyya fi Al-Ahkam Al-Hanbaliyya, clear answers for Hanbali issues, and that covers covers acts of worship. That's where you should start. Was Al-Marwazi the same as Al-Marruzi? No, they're two different people. So if Ibn Qudama was the last of Mutawassitin, would Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Qayyim, and Zainuddin ibn Rajab be considered from the Mutaakhirin? Yes, but again, this division of the scholars, some scholars will take anyone that's coming after Al-Mardawi to be the Mutaakhirin. So there are different ways that you can slice the cake, right? What's next? You can't just read it. You got to go and do the explanation that I did. Go through the explanation, cover that in detail, and then after that, inshallah ta'ala, we'll have another class on the school platform, inshallah ta'ala, and Dalil al-Talib. Yeah, so I think one thing that's important about all of this information is to never be like too dogmatic about the way that the cake is sliced. You can slice a cake in squares, you can slice it in slices, you could cut it from the middle, whatever, right? So la mashahata fil istilah is the principle. There's no there's no disagreement about terminologies created. So I could come and I can say, well, I divide this history of the madhab into two parts, pre Ibn Qudama and post Ibn Qudama. Fine. What's the utility of me doing that? utility of me doing that is I'm trying to draw attention to something, right? So that's the reason why I'm saying that is because with a lot of people studying, it's like, well, what's the mu'tamid of the madhab? Okay, but the mu'tamid in what era and what epoch and what group of scholars? The whole idea of the madhab is not to be dogmatic about what scholars said. That's for the muqallid. The student of knowledge wants to know what the scholar said and why they said it. And that's more important. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Let's see if there's anything else here. Someone says, there are different views transmitted from Imam Ahmed in al-Tahbir that he rejected using weak hadith in Fada'il. As so, how would it be worked out, if I may ask? I'll look that up. I don't know. I don't want to speak out of turn. So, I mean, there is an opinion amongst many of the Salaf that weak hadith are never resorted to. I believe that's the opinion of al-Bukhari, and Imam Ahmed is narrated from him similar, but I'll go back to the work that you referenced and look that up first, inshallah ta'ala, before making any kind of definitive statement. All right, y'all. It's 10:40. I got to go to bed. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.